Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Hey, Chris, and hello to everyone tuning in this Wednesday morning. I have to admit, I have been waiting all week for us to finally dig into this particular story.
Okay, you have me genuinely curious now, because when you say you have been waiting all week,
There is, and it is a number I cannot stop turning over in my head. 240 years. That is how old the bank we are talking about today actually is.
240 years. So this is literally a bank that was founded back when Alexander Hamilton was still alive and arguing about the financial future of a brand new country.
Exactly that bank. We are talking about BNY, which most people still call BNY Mellon, and which Alexander Hamilton helped charter in 1784 as the Bank of New York.
And the reason this is on our radar today is that this 240-year-old institution has somehow become one of the most aggressive enterprise deployers of agentic AI on the planet.
That is the headline. On their first quarter earnings call earlier this month, BNY laid out numbers that I think genuinely caught the rest of the banking world a little flat-footed.
Walk me through the headline figures, because when I first saw them, I assumed they were aspirational targets, not actual production deployments running inside a regulated bank right now.
They are production. About 220 enterprise AI solutions live across the business. Roughly 140 specialized digital employees deployed and around 20,000 humans actively building AI agents.
Let me make sure I'm parsing that correctly, because it sounds like there are two completely different categories of AI workers operating side by side at this bank in their day-to-day operations.
There are two distinct tiers. The first tier is what they call digital employees, which are persistent autonomous agents with their own identities, their own logins, and assigned human managers who supervise them.
Wait, so these are not just chatbots that pop up when you ask them a question. These things have employee profiles, badge equivalents, and a manager checking in on their performance.
Correct. They show up in the org chart in a meaningful sense. They have access controls scoped to specific systems, and they communicate with their human managers through Microsoft Teams just like any other coworker would.
That is a wild mental model shift. A risk officer at this bank could literally have a one-on-one meeting with a digital employee to review weekly output and flag performance issues.
That is the operating reality. And the second tier, the 20,000 empowered builders, is in some ways the even bigger story because that is 40% of the global workforce learning to build agents.
40% of an entire bank trained as agent builders. That is not a pilot program anymore. That is a fundamental redefinition of what a financial services job description even looks like.
It is. And the platform underneath all of this is called Eliza, currently on its 2.0 release, which is essentially a multi-agent orchestration layer the bank built internally.
I want to pause on that name for a second, because Eliza is, of course, the famous 1966 chatbot from MIT, the granddaddy of every conversational AI we use today.
It is a delicious naming choice. The original Eliza was a few hundred lines of pattern-matching code, and now a Wall Street custody bank has built an enterprise platform that borrows the name and runs on real reasoning models.
So tell me what makes Eliza 2.0 technically interesting. Because plenty of large companies have rolled out internal AI platforms, and most of them end up looking like glorified chat wrappers around one model.
The interesting bit is that Eliza is explicitly model agnostic. It sits on top of OpenAI, Google Gemini, and Anthropic models, and routes work to whichever foundation model is best suited for a given task.
That is actually quite sophisticated. So a compliance review agent might run on one model family for its reasoning chain, while a code generation agent on the same platform is pinging an entirely different vendor.
Exactly, and the bank gets two big wins from that architecture. First, they avoid getting locked into a single model provider. Second, they can hot swap when a better model lands, which is happening every couple of months now.
That second point is the underrated one. We have watched frontier capability ranking flip 3 or 4 times in the last 12 months alone. And any enterprise locked into one vendor is paying a tax on that volatility.
Right, and BNY's leadership has openly said this is intentional. They view the model layer as a commodity that will keep improving, and they want their workflow logic and their data layer to be the durable strategic assets.
Let me push back gently here, because the cynic in me wants to know if any of this is actually moving the financial needle, or if this is just a really expensive innovation theater for the earnings call.
It is a fair pushback, and the numbers they disclosed are not subtle. Onboarding times for new clients have accelerated by more than 20%, and compliance resolution workflows have improved by over 30%.
Those are the kind of operational improvements that show up directly in margins, especially in a custody business where you are processing massive transaction volume on already very thin per trade economics.
And on that custody business specifically, BNY reported about a 5% reduction in unit cost on core custody trades, which in their world is genuinely a significant margin improvement at scale.
5% on core custody is not a rounding error. That is the kind of number that makes the chief financial officer suddenly very interested in why the AI budget is what it is.
There is also a stunning number on the engineering side that I think gets undersold in the coverage. Roughly 40% of the bank's code is now authored by AI, contributing to a double-digit increase in software release velocity.
40% of the code at a regulated bank is being written by AI agents. That has enormous implications for how internal audit, model risk management, and the compliance function need to evolve in response.
It really does, and BNY is leaning into that change rather than hiding from it, which is part of why I find this story so much more interesting than the typical big bank AI press release.
Talk to me about the human side, because when I hear 20,000 empowered builders, my first instinct is to ask what happens to the people who used to do the work those agents are now doing.
That is the question every employee in financial services is asking right now. And BNY's answer so far has been notably different from the layoff first playbook we saw out of, say, the Snap story we covered Monday.
Yeah, the Snap framing was very much about cost cutting and headcount reduction as the primary AI use case. BNY's framing seems to be about upskilling the existing workforce into agent builders and agent supervisors.
It is, and the executives have explicitly described it as the most consequential technology shift since the personal computer or the spreadsheet, where the goal is to make every employee multiplicatively more capable rather than redundant.
That is a beautiful narrative, but I want to know what the actual training pipeline looks like, because turning a custody operations analyst into someone who can responsibly build an autonomous agent is not a weekend boot camp.
They have built out an internal AI bootcamp curriculum, and CNBC reported in February that the bank is spending billions on technology, with significant chunks going specifically to this education and tooling build-out for employees.
Billions with a B, and that lines up with what we have seen from other Tier 1 banks, where the AI line item has gone from a rounding error to a top 3 technology investment in just the last couple of years.
And BNY's chief executive, Reinv, has been explicit that the bank is repositioning itself, in his words, as an operating partner embedded in client workflows rather than just a provider of custody, payments, and treasury services.
That is a meaningful strategic repositioning, because the moat there shifts from balance sheet scale to workflow integration depth. And once you are deep inside a client's operating layer, it is very hard to rip you out.
That is the platform banking thesis in a nutshell. And the Agentic AI investment is the mechanism that lets a custody bank credibly claim it can sit inside a corporate treasury team's daily workflow at that level.
Let me play devil's advocate on the risk side for a moment, because giving autonomous agents logins, access to internal databases, and the ability to take actions in production systems is a meaningful new attack surface.
It absolutely is, and we just covered the Vercel and Context.ai breach last Thursday, which was specifically about an OAuth token from an AI browser extension getting weaponized into a software supply chain attack.
Right, and the lesson from that incident was that any AI system with persistent credentials to a production environment is, in security terms, indistinguishable from any other privileged service account that can be compromised.
BNY appears to be aware of this and has built out controls, but I think it is fair to say the entire industry is still figuring out the audit and observability standards for agent populations of this scale.
There is a real governance gap here. Traditional model risk management frameworks were designed for a small number of models, doing a small number of things, not for a fleet of 140 digital employees.
Exactly, and that is going to be the next regulatory front. The Office of the Comptroller and the Federal Reserve are watching this rollout very closely, because what BNY does today becomes the template for the rest of the sector tomorrow.
So if I had to summarize the strategic significance for our listeners, what would you put as the 1 or 2 takeaways that someone running an enterprise AI program elsewhere should pull out of the BNY playbook?
I would highlight 2 things. First, the dual-track approach of digital employees plus empowered builders is the most sophisticated workforce model I have seen, and it is exportable to almost any large enterprise context.
That dual track is genuinely elegant because it gives you the deep automation of always-on agents while also massively scaling the human capacity to invent new agents that solve problems leadership has not yet thought of.
And the second takeaway is the model agnostic platform bet, which I think will look obvious in retrospect, but is still the road less traveled. Because most enterprises are quietly pot committed to a single foundation model vendor.
Yeah, the lock-in problem is real, and the fact that a regulated bank with the lowest possible appetite for vendor concentration risk has chosen this path is itself a fairly strong signal for the rest of us.
It is, and one last thing worth mentioning is that BNY has effectively turned its internal AI strategy into a marketable asset, because corporate clients are now asking how they can plug into Eliza-style workflows themselves.
That is the platform banking flywheel in action. The internal AI investment becomes a product offering, which becomes a revenue line, which justifies further investment in the platform, which strengthens the moat all over again.
Which is exactly the loop OpenAI's case study on BNY highlights, where the bank's AI for everyone, everywhere strategy has produced both internal productivity wins and a new external commercial surface area for the firm.
All right, I think we have given listeners a really rich picture of why this is more than just another enterprise AI press release, and why the BNY story matters far beyond the walls of One Custody Bank.
One more thing I want to flag before we wrap, which is that BNY has signaled the next phase will move agents from reactive to proactive with predictive trade analytics that autonomously initiate remediation before settlement failures occur.
That phrase, autonomously initiate remediation, is the one that keeps me up at night a little bit. Because that is the moment agents stop being assistants and start being decision makers inside the financial plumbing itself.
I would just add that I'm going to be watching the next earnings call extremely carefully for any signs that the digital employee count is accelerating, because the slope of that curve is the real leading indicator here.
That is a great place to leave it for today. And we will absolutely revisit this story when the next set of numbers lands and we can see whether the Agentic era is actually delivering at scale. That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.